Ready to dive into something pretty deep. We're tackling a pattern theory of self today, and trust me, this isn't your typical self-help stuff. We're about to weave through philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, even a little Buddhism, all that good stuff, to really break down this idea that the self is more like a dynamic pattern, always moving and changing, rather than just a static thing.
It really is a fascinating departure from those traditional models that try to define the self, like trying to fit it in a box.
Absolutely. I'm already picturing something way more like a kaleidoscope than a simple portrait. What's really hitting home for me from this research is this emphasis on how everything that makes us us is interconnected. Like it's not just a collection of random parts.
It's not about stacking up personality traits like building blocks, is it? It's about understanding these different processes. Like, think about it. Our bodily experiences, emotions, actions, thoughts, even the stories we tell ourselves, and our position in the world. It's about how these threads come together, you know,
Mm.
to create this intricate tapestry of the self.
Okay, so like a tapestry, right? They're all those individual threads, but it's how they're woven together that creates the whole picture.
Exactly. And that's where that cake analogy from the source material doesn't quite cut it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
We're not talking about a bunch of ingredients blending into one homogeneous blob. Think of it more like jazz musicians, each riffing off of one another. Each one is unique, distinct, but they create something dynamic and ever-changing together.
I love that analogy. It's like we have our own personal jazz band inside, constantly jamming and responding to everything around us. Now, the research mentions some big names in self-study like William James and Ulrich Neisser. How did they contribute to this pattern concept?
Well, both James and Neisser, they were already pushing against this idea of one fixed self. They recognized that we actually experience ourselves differently in different contexts. Like, think about how you might act at work, and then compare that to how you are with close friends, right? Totally different. They were interested in those different facets of the self, like the ecological self, which is tied to our physical presence, or the interpersonal self, which is the self we share with other people. It was a step towards understanding the complexity of the self for sure.
So, not multiple personalities, but more like multiple dimensions of one very dynamic and ever-changing personality.
Exactly. One concept that I found really interesting is the minimal self.
Okay, minimal self. Now that sounds kind of philosophical. Break that down for me.
Imagine the most basic level of self-awareness, that gut feeling of mindness that's connected to our experiences, right?
Yeah.
Like when you stub your toe, it's that instant, OW, my toe, before you even have time to think about it.
So it's that raw, instinctual sense of being a distinct self that's experiencing the world.
Precisely. And there's debate about how much external factors like our upbringing or our culture, how much they really shape this minimal self. Some argue it's hardwired into us, part of our biology, while others believe it's more fluid, adapting to our experiences.
It really makes you wonder what's truly at the core of our being and how much is influenced by the world around us. So we've got this minimal self, this basic sense of me, but there's got to be more to it than just that, right?
You're absolutely right. The research gets into this whole orchestra of processes that make up this self pattern.
Okay, hit me with these processes. Let's hear what makes up this orchestra.
All right, first up, we have bodily processes. And this isn't just about, having a body. It's about how our body experiences the world. It's feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin, or the ache in your muscles after a run, or even just the way your body reacts to things around you. It's these physical experiences that ground us, that root us in reality.
So it's not just a physical body. It's the way that body interacts with the world to create our sense of self.
Exactly. And then we add in affective processes. Think of this as your emotional landscape. All those feelings, from the small joys like a sunny day to deeper emotions like grief. That roller coaster of emotions, right? And how we experience and respond to those emotions. That shapes us too.
So our emotions aren't just fleeting, they're woven into who we are.
Exactly. Now let's add another layer. We have behavioral and action processes. This is about what we do, our actions, the habits we form. All those actions, whether we're conscious of them or not, they're like brushstrokes, painting the picture of ourselves.
So you're saying our actions speak louder than words, that even when we aren't saying who we are, we're showing it through what we do.
Precisely. For example, think about someone really dedicated to their craft, like a musician, a painter, or a writer. The hours they put into honing their skills, those actions don't just lead to results, they shape their sense of self. They become the musician, the artist, the writer.
It's like our actions create a narrative of who we are one step at a time. And that leads us into the realm of Cognitive, psychological, and reflective processes, right?
Yeah.
This is where we really get into our heads.
Exactly. This is like the conductor of the orchestra, the part of you that's thinking, analyzing, remembering, and making sense of the world. It's the beliefs we hold, our memories, the way we interpret things. All of that feeds into our cognitive self.
Our inner world, trying to understand it all. And then we have the narrative self, right? Those stories we tell ourselves about ourselves.
You got it. It's that story we create about our own lives, bringing together those memories, experiences, beliefs, creating a sense of coherence.
So our self is, in part, a story, one that's probably edited and revised over time.
Exactly. Your narrative self is always evolving, changing with new experiences and reflection. It's how we understand our past, handle the present, and look to the future.
Which makes me think about how unreliable our memories can be. The way we remember something can be swayed by the story we've already created about ourselves.
That's such a good point. Memories aren't like perfect recordings of the past. They're filtered through our emotions, beliefs, and the narratives we've already built. Now, we're not just isolated islands creating these narratives alone. We're social creatures, and that leads us to intersubjective processes.
Right. We are connected to others, and those connections are shaping who we are.
You got it. Intersubjective processes highlight how our interactions with everyone, family, friends, coworkers, even strangers, how those interactions mold our self-pattern. Think about how differently you might express yourself with close friends versus, say, in a job interview.
It's like we're constantly co-creating ourselves in relation to others, adapting, responding to the social world.
Precisely. Our self isn't just this internal thing, it's relational, shaped by the social world we live in. And finally, we have ecological and normative processes.
Okay, how do those fit into this self-symphony?
Think about your environment, like your physical surroundings, the culture you're in, societal norms and values. All of those things subtly influence your beliefs, your behavior, even your aspirations.
It's like our environment provides the background for our self-portrait, setting the stage for who we become.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating to consider how much our environment, both physical and cultural, contributes to who we are.
So we've got this complex web of processes, the physical, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, the narrative, relational, ecological, and normative. That's a lot. What does this pattern theory of self really mean for us in our lives? It makes you wonder, when we're looking at this intricate self pattern, what happens when those threads get disrupted, you know?
Yeah.
And the research actually gets into that heavier stuff. It explores how this pattern can kind of unravel when we're talking about mental disorders.
It's a tough thing to think about for sure, but it's important. When we look at how the self-pattern can break down, it helps us understand just how complex and fragile it really is.
Ah.
It's like, imagine holding up a mosaic that has cracks in it. The cracks themselves can tell us something about how the mosaic was originally put together.
Okay, so let's look at these cracks. What kind of disorders are we talking about?
Well, the research specifically mentions autism spectrum disorder.
Hmm.
It talks about how the challenges with social interaction and communication too. Those are things that individuals with ASD often experience, and how that could be connected to disruptions in certain parts of the self pattern.
Okay.
For example, those intersubjective processes, the way we were talking about how we understand and respond to social cues, well, those might work differently.
So someone with ASD might be experiencing the world and themselves differently than someone who's neurotypical.
Exactly. And that difference can lead to misunderstandings and difficulties in social situations. It highlights how important it is to recognize and respect all those different human experiences, even within this framework of the self that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Are there other disorders that are discussed?
Yeah, schizophrenia is another one. The research focuses on those experiences of delusions of control, where someone feels like their actions are being controlled by something or someone else. It's a really distressing symptom, but it gives us a glimpse into the relationship between agency and ownership within the self-pattern.
Makes you wonder what it means to be in control. To be in control of your own actions, your own body, yourself.
Precisely. The research also gets into how depression impacts the self-pattern, specifically how it affects our sense of agency and our motivation.
I can see that. Thinking back to times when I've been depressed, I felt like the world just lost its color. Even simple tasks felt impossible.
That's a really important point.
Hmm.
The research actually uses a powerful image. It talks about a field of relevant affordances that shrinks during depression. Imagine all the possibilities, for action and interaction that are around you. That's your affordance space.
Okay.
Depression constricts that space, making you feel stuck, hopeless.
So your world literally gets smaller, And with it, your sense of what you can do, who you can be.
Exactly. Now, the research also explores what's probably the most extreme example of disruption to the self path, the potential for the self pattern to completely break down in cases of severe trauma, like torture or solitary confinement.
That's heavy stuff. What happens to our sense of self in those kinds of
Those
situations?
situations, they're a direct attack on the very core of the self pattern,
Hmm.
especially on those intersubjective processes, those connections that we form with others. When you intentionally break those connections, distort them, the self can fragment, and that can lead to really intense psychological distress.
It's a powerful reminder of how important our connections are to us, to who we are.
Yes, exactly. But even though the research looks at these really difficult situations, it also talks about the possibility of reshaping the self pattern, which is really interesting.
Okay, reshaping the self, what would that look like?
Well, on a larger, more futuristic scale, there's the idea of mind uploading, which is transferring your consciousness to a digital space.
Whoa, that sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. What does that even mean for the self?
It makes you think about the nature of the self and about embodiment, too.
Right.
If our self is closely tied to our physical body, like the research suggests, what happens when we take that physical part away?
Right.
Is a digital self really the same as who we are?
It really makes you question what it means to be human, to have a self that exists in the world.
Absolutely. On a more practical level, the research also mentions the use of technology, like VR, for therapy. Imagine creating safe spaces, controlled environments in VR, where someone who struggles with things like social anxiety can practice interacting, slowly build up their comfort zones. It's a way of reshaping their self-pattern.
That's really interesting, like using technology to create a space for self-discovery and growth.
Exactly. And since we're already talking about reshaping the self, the research also brings up something else, the ancient wisdom of Buddhist philosophy.
Okay, let's hear it. How does Buddhism play into this?
Buddhism encourages us to question that attachment we often have to a fixed, unchanging sense of self. Instead, it encourages us to see the impermanent, interconnected nature of our being. Practices like mindfulness and meditation can actually help us become more aware of these constantly shifting patterns of the self. And that can bring a sense of acceptance and peace, even amidst all the changes.
So letting go of the need to be in control of every aspect of the self, learning to be okay with the flow.
Exactly. And that brings us to something for you to think about. If the self is this dynamic pattern that's always changing, what does that mean for your own journey of self-discovery? What parts of yourself are you looking to understand better? What will you create in the grand story of your life?
Thanks for joining us, everybody, for this deep dive into the pattern theory of self. It's definitely given us all a lot to think about, and we hope you'll continue exploring these ideas with us.